Let's look at number 7. This is just weird looking. We have a very strange interval between very short part. That's negative 45 degrees to positive 45 degrees, or again from negative pi over 4 to positive pi over 4. And look, it's 6 over pi. You should already be thinking, oh my, this is going to be in decimals. So just to let you know, negative pi over 4 is approximately 0.79 negative. So our answers have to be between those numbers. A little bit bigger than 0, a little bit less than 0. So this curve is 2 cosine squared x, and this line is where y equals to 6 over pi, and it looks like they intersect twice. So I should get 2 answers. Well, let's get there. So the first thing I need to do to isolate my cosine is I'm going to divide both sides by 2. So if I divide by 2, I'm going to get 3 over pi. Now to go from something squared to not squared, I have to take the square root of both sides. And I'm going to go ahead and instead of saying plus or minus, I'm going to write it like this. You do need that plus or minus, but you're looking at those two things. Well, let's stop right there. Think about our interval. Okay? So we have a little bit of quadrant 1 and a little bit of quadrant 4. Going back to that unit circle, cosine. Where is the cosine positive? The cosine is positive in quadrant 1 and quadrant 4. They're the x values. Where's the cosine negative? In quadrant 2 and quadrant 3. That's over here. Where are those angles? Here's pi over 4. Here's negative pi over 4. That's the only place my answers can be. So am I ever going to be over here where the cosine is negative? No. This is outside our interval. If our interval was between 0 and 2 pi or something different, we would have included those. So we can knock that out. Now let's go back to here. We've got to solve for x. So I want the inverse cosine of the square root of 3 over pi. Again, this is not something that's going to be on that chart that you've memorized. You want to go to your calculator, make sure it's in radian mode, punch it in, and it's going to tell you x is about 0.21. That's about right here, 0.21. And again, that's in quadrant 1. I need an answer in quadrant 4. But I need a negative answer. That actually makes it easier. Okay, so if this is 0.21, what's that going to be? Negative 0.21. So a little bit easier because of that negative positive interval. But you've got to be thinking all the time, are my answers within my given interval? Now we have sine and cosine. That is not good. We can't change sine to cosine. There's no identities that really relate to this. So we have to separate it. So how are we going to do that? Well, let's think about factoring, which really is what we did in problems 5 and 6. We factored it to kind of separate it into two linear equations. And you're going, well, but that's not quadratic. That's not even 3 terms. Well, what about a greatest common factor? They both have cosine x. So let's pull that out, and that would leave 2 sine x plus the square root of 3. And before I go any further, looking at my picture, just to tell you this is from negative pi to positive pi, because that's my given interval, and then I graphed this, which is the curve, and since I want to know when does it equal to 0, when does it cross the x-axis. And it looks like I should have 4 answers. So let's see if I can get there. So I have factored. I want to set each factor equal to 0. And solve. I'm going to subtract the square root of 3 and divide by 2. Now these values should look familiar. You should say, oh, I know these. This is on my chart. That's right. Just got to make sure it fits within that given interval. I'm going to kind of think about my cosine wave that looks like this, between 0 and 2 pi, which is not that interval. But when does it hit 0? Well, it hits it at pi over 2, which is in my interval. Hits it at 3 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2, which is not in my interval. I need to go backwards. Okay, so this is positive pi over 2. Going backwards, it would be negative pi over 2. Or however you think, 90 degrees and negative 90 degrees. What about this one? X is equal to the inverse sine of negative square root of 3 over 2. The sign is negative in what two quadrants? The sign is the y value, so it's negative in quadrants 3 and quadrant 4. Where's this? Quadrant 3 and 4. Well, this is 0, and somewhere along the line is negative pi over 2. And over here might be pi over 2 and pi. How does those four things correspond to that? Well, this would be quadrant 1. That would be quadrant 2. Going backwards, this is quadrant 4, and this is quadrant 3. I know, very confusing. Inverse sine of negative square root of 3 over 2 in those given intervals is that. Now, on your chart, you learned it as positive 5 pi over 3. You have to express that as a negative angle. You also learned in quadrant 4 that the angle was 4 pi over 3, positive. But I need to express it as a negative angle, which would be negative 2 pi over 3. These answers may be correct in a different interval, but they're not correct for this interval. You've just got to be thinking all the time how you can express positive angles as negative angles and vice versa. Last example, some tangents. So we're going to go from 0 to 2 pi, and I graphed this, and I want to know when does it cross the x-axis, or when y equals to 0, and it looks like I should have 5 answers. Got to show my work to get there. So let's see. I'm going to add 6, and I'm going to divide by 2, and I'm going to take the square root, and I'm going to remember, to take the negative and the positive. Remember, when you take a square root, don't forget that, plus or minus. And you should say, oh, those are values I should know. And yay, it's between 0 and 2 pi. That's not too bad. Algebraically, that's what you're doing. You should know that tangent is positive in quadrant 1 and quadrant 3. It's at 60 degrees, or pi over 3, and 4 pi over 3. And for this one, the tangent is negative in the other two quadrants, quadrants 2 and 4. And again, giving it between 0 and 2 pi makes it a little bit easier. It's what we've memorized. And so here we should have 2/3 pi and 5/3 pi. And let's see, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 answers. 1, 2, 3, 4. Those look reasonable. Again, if you want to know how to do these graphs on your graphing calculator, come see me. It's pretty easy. You've just got to be very careful with all your parentheses. So again, what we've done today is you want to isolate that variable, be careful about your interval, and make sure your answers are within that given interval.